Hello, Ron Gerber here from AngelBeat. Glad to have one of AWS's top solution architects, Steve Woodard, on the line or on this webinar. One of the big things that people ask me all the time is, okay, I'm going to use AWS, I'm going to go to the cloud, but how exactly do I architect compute? Because it's not as if there is just one monolithic computing cloud platform available. All of this has to be customized based on your performance requirements, the scope of your company, and a number of financial considerations as well. So that's what I've asked Steve to focus on, is to share with all of us his expertise in this area, so then you can get practical guidance as you're migrating to the cloud. How do you do that in the most cost-effective way? So without further ado, let me turn it over to Steve.
Thanks, Ron. I really appreciate that. Thanks for the warm introduction. Thanks for letting me come and talk to the AngelBeat community. Really excited to talk to you about some things that I find that I have these constant conversations with customers is around cost. And how can I improve efficiency, and how do I basically reduce or lower costs? How do I reduce that total cost of ownership and maximize that return on investment, or the ROI? And I put together the slide deck and really just wanted to focus on the compute platform, since we're deploying our applications to compute, and we want to get the most elasticity out of those resources as possible. So I want to walk you through some things that I seem to be having a lot of conversations with customers about when it comes to the compute platform. So just a couple of things that I want to kind of talk about is some different techniques that we see evolving with customers, some things that they should be aware about. We'll talk about some architectural improvements of, all right, so I've already got this environment, I want to make some improvements, where do I start? And the services that we are specifically going to focus on for this talk are going to be around the EC2, or the compute platform specifically. So AWS is constantly looking for ways to reduce cost, and with each new generation of an instance family, we're able to offer you better performance at a lower cost. And typically on-prem is that we haven't really been able to see this. Typically it's the reverse. It's with newer generations come higher costs with on-prem. But now with AWS and moving into the cloud is that you get more benefits when it comes to the newer generation model. So a couple things that you wanted to look at here is you want to look at newer generations as a way for you to start to reduce cost. Moving to those newer generations can save you a substantial amount of money when you're running your specific workloads. Another thing to look at is look for your cost explorer and look at your EC2 usage reports. These were two things that I talked on in the previous talk about how you can gain insights as to how my workload has been trending, how my cost is trending. And two tools that you could use to get those insights is the AWS Cost Explorer and the EC2 usage reports. Another thing we want to look at is our EBS instances, right? So if we're moving to a newer generations of instances, it's really kind of worth pointing out that several older instances charge for EBS optimization, whereas with many newer instances, this is going to be additional functionality by default at no additional cost. So if you look at older generation instances like your C1, your C3, or your G2, and even your R3 instances, they basically now support EBS optimization. And if you're running these older instances, you may notice additional savings if you are paying for EBS optimization when you move to those newer generation instances. And you can get this insight by also these tools is looking at your billing console, looking at the console itself under the Trusted Advisor tool. And then also you can gain insights by basically querying this using API or the CLI. So rightsizing is really when we basically look at the application and really want to utilize as much bang for the buck as possible. So rightsizing the instances is very, very important. So for example, a customer of ours, Sprinkler, upgraded their MongoDB software from version 3.2, which included a new storage engine at the time called WireTiger. And this new storage engine provided significant boost in I/O and allowed that customer to eliminate the need for provisioned IOPS. storage, which resulted in $50,000 per month savings. And because of this, it's really important to continuously review application versions for upgrades and what are the new enhancements that may come with it. So a couple things you can look at again for tools are things like License Manager, Systems Manager Inventory, and your AWS Application Discovery. And these are tools that you can leverage to look at specifically if you're trending towards an application upgrade or an OS upgrade. And we'll talk a little bit more about licensing here in a second. So licensing use. Many customers are going to be looking at licensing use, whether it's bring your own licenses, or if in fact, if it's something that you're going to basically provision and use our licensing or basically your licensing. And dedicated hosts is a way that allows you to use existing per socket or per core licenses, such as Microsoft Windows Server, Microsoft SQL Server, or if you're using SUSE or Red Hat, or if in fact, if you're struggling to meet compliance or regulatory requirements. So if you're looking at this, depending upon the dedicated host size, you're given a certain number of slots that you can then launch your instances. So for example, an M5 dedicated host provides up to 48 slots to launch an M5 large instance, or 24 slots for an M5 extra large. And that M5 dedicated host contains 2 sockets and 48 cores that you would need to comply for licensing purposes. And then the instance running on that host all share the same licenses. So you can look at, again, tools, you can look at this for our billing console, AWS config, and license manager. So just think of a way for you to use dedicated host as, this is my host, I want to be able to launch instances in a dedicated tenancy, so that way it's single tenancy and I'm not having to share that hypervisor with anybody else. So again, we want to look at licensing. Another way to look at licensing are licensing options and consider those open source alternatives, such as migrating from paid Linux distributions to potentially using open source counterparts like Amazon Linux or CentOS. Also, the thing to consider is database licensing can also be a contributing factor on cost. So you want to look to basically move paid database solutions such as Microsoft SQL Server and Oracle to MySQL, Postgres, and Amazon's Aurora. And in some places, you can save by purchasing licenses from the marketplace itself. Since most of the licensing on the marketplace offers a per hour pricing, you can benefit by using software without a contract, and you only pay for when you use, when you're using that software. And you can even use tools like Application Discovery Service, EC2 Systems Manager, to even conduct that routine inventory of your environment and look for less expensive alternatives to currently licensed products. So right-sizing, the question is, what size of an instance do I really need? The 2 main root causes of over-provisioning are things like project prioritization, where management or the app owners want to look at an instance and say, let's just get it up and running and then we'll optimize it later. That's perfectly fine, but there needs to be a way that you need to be able to monitor the usage and spend with a planned time to optimize. Otherwise, if you look at the total cost of ownership for that application, what would that look like? Another root cause is telemetry blockers. And this attribute is a lack of historical metrics and data related to the seasonality and the peak periods of that application. Now, it's really important to understand and identify and address telemetry coverages, telemetry coverage gaps, and measure metrics such as CPU, memory, and disk, and even network to get an understanding of the actual usage of that EC2 instance. It's really easy to over-provision, specifically when it comes to capacity. So you want to review the utilization metrics and ensure that you're not over-provisioning your instances for the workloads they're running. And really, as a rule of thumb, the real key to right-sizing here is you don't want to have to pay for additional instances if you're not using those. So the great thing about the cloud is the ability for elasticity and scalability. So with a couple of API calls, I can change my instance type up or I can change it down. And you can look at this through things like Cost Explorer, the Rightsizing recommendations, which also comes with Trusted Advisor, which looks at your baseline and provides recommendations. You can also look at CloudWatch and also, like I said, Trusted Advisor as well. And let's take a look at a couple different instance types and different instance families to kind of help bring some clarity to it. All right, so we look at this and we say, all right, so I'm going to run an application. I need to identify the instance type that I'm going to run. Well, there's a lot of different instance types you can run. So if you know the type of workload that you plan to deploy to EC2, then you can pick the right instance family. So for example, if you're going to deploy an app or deploy an environment into your lower environment, such as development or testing, you may want to choose a smaller class of instance. If in fact, if you're going up into things like production and you need more compute or memory, you may want to basically start to utilize the compute or memory optimized. And you want to look at that period of time over 13 months and really start to see what your workload is doing. And you can scale up or scale down. So for a perfect example is, let me just run through a couple of these here, is when we look at general purpose, this is a balance of compute, memory, and networking. And this really fits a diverse set of workloads, such as web applications. When you start looking at things like compute, you start getting into high performance applications where they need higher processing. So you think of media transcoding, scientific modeling, or even machine learning. And of course, we get into memory optimized. This is really where we start to work with large amounts of data sets in memory. So you think about a database server, or even like web caches, or even if you're processing some data analytics, would be a great use case or a good fit for the memory optimized. And of course, we look at things like accelerated computing. Now, accelerated computing is really interesting because as we start to get more into the environments of things like high performance computing or GPU bound or machine learning, where we're working with things like autonomous vehicles, we can then start to basically then use the accelerated computing instance classes for those specific type of workloads. And then finally, we look at storage optimized. Now, storage optimized is really a very unique fit. So if we have a specific use case or a workload where it's going to need high sequential read and write with large data sets, you want to use storage optimized. So another example could be things like a NoSQL databases, or even using an Elasticsearch or an ELK stack. This is really where you want to start to use the instance family under the storage optimized to give you that best performance. All right, now I've chosen my instance. What next? Well, let's take a look at the Cost Explorer. AWS recently introduced a new feature within Cost Explorer, and that's called EC2 Rightsizing. And once this is enabled, the recommendation tool provides that optimization opportunities for EC2 instances across all of your linked accounts, including your estimated monthly savings. So you can even filter the recommendations by region, by tag, or even by a linked account. And the results are really worked within an exportable CSV file. And it just is another way for you to get accurate recommendations, specifically if custom metrics or things like if you're using custom metrics, if they're enabled on their particular instances. So just another great way that customers are taking advantage of this is by using this new feature. Let's take a look at something that a lot of customers tend to run, the T3 class. And this T3 instance provides just an essential CPU performance with that ability to burst CPU usage at any time for as long as it's required. And these are designed for applications with moderate CPU usage and that experience temporary spikes in use. And they offer a great balance of compute, memory, and networking. Just one thing to keep in mind is that this is a great instance type for a wide variety of workloads for things like medium scale databases, virtual desktops, production and web applications, and even source code repositories. And they're even better for things like development environments because they're very low, because they're small footprint, they offer great performance at such a low price. So really the benefits here is that about T3 that I talked to customers about is that T3, the specific instances, they make use of CPU credits when a workload is operating below the baseline. And then it uses those credits when it runs above the threshold. So again, another great example of this is a T3 medium has a baseline of 20%. And for every hour under that utilization or under that baseline, 24 CPU credits are earned. So one CPU credit is equal to one virtual CPU running at 100% utilization for 1 minute, which is a substantial savings for a lot of customers. So again, is that many workloads here, when we're talking about a T3 standards, many workloads are burstable. So think about things like web tiers or application servers. It's really important for you to review those CloudWatch CPU usage metrics and determine if you have a good candidate for T3 instance types. All right, so I've got my T3 instance. What next? Well, even more savings here when we're talking about stopping an instance here. So even if you stop an instance, you'll continue to incur cost for EBS volumes that are attached to them. Now, that's very, very important because if your instance is stopped, I'm not spending any money, but I'm still being charged if I have an EBS volume that are attached to it. It's really important to be aware of all the instances that are stopped. So in this screen, I'm looking at a series of instances that are stopped. But I also want to make sure that those EBS volumes don't incur additional costs. So even for instances that you stop in a particular reason, for example, if you can look at these instances that have been basically spun up programmatically, so for example, like if you do this through a CloudFormation script, you probably don't need to incur additional unnecessary costs and EBS charges. So when you terminate the instance, you want to take a snapshot of the EBS volume, take a snapshot, and then delete the EBS volume. It's better, it's much, much better because you save more money and you lower your footprint by taking a snapshot of the EBS volume and then simply deleting the EBS volume. And if you need to restore that snapshot, you can just restore the snapshot back to an EBS volume and then reattach it to an instance. So when we talk about terminate instances, that's a good question is, what happens if I terminate my instance? So an impaired instance, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. If we look at an impaired instance, if you want to think about it, it's just an instance that was unable to properly start or pass a health check. We want to be able to think of resources as disposable. So we launch an instance, we take a snapshot of that, create an AMI, and then we take that instance and then we make that disposable. So if we have a problem where we're starting it up, these instances get stuck in a state where they can't start. You don't want to be charged for instances that are in a stuck state during this time. So it's really important to review those instances that are impaired and then really just quickly terminate them. Alternatively, what you can do is you can stop and start the instance and see if you basically can recover onto a new underlying host. So if that was the case, you want to enable a feature called EC2 Auto Recovery, and that EC2 Auto Recovery will detect if that instance is impaired and will automatically stop and start that instance for you. So another really cool feature. So here we basically have 3 different types of purchasing options when we look at EC2. And I talk to customers all of the time about different purchasing options. So if we look at these, we have reserved instances, on demand, and spot. And there's different workloads for different use cases and different workloads depending upon what we're going to basically be deploying it to. So I'll run through these really quickly here. So for instances that are continuously running and have a steady usage pattern, such as databases or cluster master nodes, and you basically want to get your base load against those, or basically run those base load against those application servers. Reserved instances are your best choice since you can predict the usage and you will get discounts for a term commitment. And typically that's 1 or 3 years. So I always tell customers, if you know your workload over a period of 13 months and you can predict it, reserved instances are best for you. So for things like that are spiky but predictable, things like have annual, or if you have unpredictable usage patterns, such as annual events, like if you were thinking about a Super Bowl or a new product release, or even for things like school registration periods. And you basically want to have a mix of all 3. You would want to think about considering using on demand if you're not really sure what that workload is going to be over a period of 13 months. And then finally, for things like For things like batch processing, or if you have a job that wants to run overnight, or you don't really matter, it doesn't really matter when it needs to run. Spot is really, really great for that. And it allows you to basically run workloads on kind of an eBay type of pricing model. So you get a chance to bid on unused EC2 compute capacity, and your workloads will run when that bid price matches that spot price. So another great feature that allows you to be flexible across 3 different purchasing options. Now, elasticity and auto-scaling, it's really important to avoid paying for instances that are not being used where possible. And I talk to customers a lot. So if you look at things like your lower environment, such as development and testing, or non-prod instances, or instances with scheduled runtimes. A good example of this is a customer we have, Ralph Lauren. Everyone's familiar with the brand Ralph Lauren. They were able to save $10,000 per month when they were using scheduled auto scaling, where they were able to turn those resources off when they were not needed. So for example, you have a development environment. That development environment runs from basically Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. After 5 p.m., those resources don't need to run. You can save money by turning those resources off. Another example is you might have some batch jobs that only need to run on the weekends. Here is where you can schedule those instances to start during this time. Or you might have a workload that basically its peak is at the end of the month. And here you want to ensure that you have auto scaling enabled to meet the new demand. And the great thing about auto scaling is that, again, is that you can have elasticity without changing your architecture. So if you think about it, auto scaling allows you to scale up and or down based on the demand and usage, which translate to specific metrics for things such as CPU utilization or a number of requests. And you can even leverage all 3 pricing options, as we showed in the previous slide, across reserved instances, on-demand, or spot. So you can basically do this as a way to manage scheduling instances that can help use AWS solution, or basically you can use these to basically scale up or scale down without changing that architecture, which is really, really cool. And I'll talk a little bit about Instance Scheduler here. An Instance Scheduler is our AWS solution, and it's basically a CloudFormation stack that you run in your account, and you define schedules that pertain to different workloads, teams, or individuals. And the great thing about this is that those schedules are stored in a DynamoDB table, and they can be modified by updating the table or leveraging the command line tool. So what you do here is you tag each instance with the schedule name, and this solution will automatically stop and start instances inside that schedule. And if you think about it, the solution really leverages CloudWatch events and a Lambda function, which is our serverless way for you to run code in response to events, to maintain that schedule, which is also a great alternative to running cron jobs, or basically these are scheduled tasks, and that you may run these across EC2 instances. And the beauty here is, since you only pay for the invocation of the Lambda, which has a free tier of 1 million requests per month for free, it may be significantly cheaper than running on EC2 24/7 to execute these jobs. Talking about Spot a little bit here is, let's say, for example, with Spot, you can save up to 90% over on-demand pricing. And I always talk about Spot is best suited for stateless or batch processing workloads that can tolerate being terminated. So Spot can be used for stateless web tiers, and it can be a complement to other pricing options such as on-demand and reserved instances to ensure that the minimum demand is being met. So another customer example is Lyft. Lyft was able to save 75% a month, or up to 75% a month by simply leveraging Spot. Another customer, National Instruments, with EC2 Spot, they saved 85 to 90% in costs on their monthly bill. So if you look at it, is that we have a separate module on Spot, and that really can go into more detail about basically how you can schedule schedule your Spot fleets and things like that. So you really want to be able to leverage things like Spot instances or Spot fleets to be able to do those type of batch processing to be able to achieve even greater lower costs. So if we look at this again in total is really just saying, listen, in order to really avoid any unnecessary cost, it's important to really ensure that your instances are following security best practices. So if you want to say, I only want to allow, or only want to look at, only allowing specific ports from the internet and not involving any type of potential malicious users to take up your data or basically transfer your bill or anything else, is that you want to know what's happening in your account. So you want to look at things like Session Manager. Session Manager allows you to SSH or RDP into instances by leveraging the AWS API, IAM for authentication without needing SSH keys. It's just another way for you to really use these tools to get insight into what's happening in your account. So really to kind of sum things up when we look at it here is that, again, these tools we can leverage are things like Trusted Advisor, Inspector. So if you're looking at CIS hardening rules or CIS benchmarking, you can leverage a tool like in Amazon Inspector. Amazon Security Advisories, you can even use like things like the GitHub Security plugin, and even leveraging things like CloudTrail. So stepping back, really, when we look at it, these are all just great tools that we can use and leverage to continue to enhance and even lower our production costs. And here I basically just plugged in a link here of where you can go to start saving, which is basically where you can start to learn a little bit more about cost management. I highly encourage you to work with your AWS solutions architect, work with your AWS account manager, or even just going to visiting here this link to look at more cost management strategies on how you can further reduce your bill. And with that, back over to you, Ron.
Oh, thanks so much, Steve. This was very informative for me because we know that people are very keen on going to the cloud, but in today's challenging times, they want to make sure they're doing that in the most cost-effective way. And clearly there's a whole slew of options, but one of the concluding comments I'd like to make is the importance of relying upon people like Steve, who's based here in Florida, but he has counterparts throughout the United States and quite honestly throughout the world who probably have seen similar architecture, similar software programs in use in some of their other clients. And so while it's good to take advantage of this webinar, go to this link, you really want to also take advantage of your local AWS account or technical experts. You can go to angelbeat.com, #AngelBeat, and I'll make sure we put you in touch with the right experts who could then make sure that you're not, or at least you're taking full advantage of other organizations who already have been there, done that, and therefore can accelerate your journey to the cloud. Does that make sense, Steve?
Absolutely.
Yep. Other than that, I hope everyone is staying safe, taking advantage of all this technology. I know in these challenging times, everyone's personal work activities have been dramatically changed, but I think it's also illustrating how technology is going to only become more important in the future. I encourage you to keep following AngelBeat, go to our virtual summits featuring at AWS, watch our webinars, and I look forward to hopefully seeing everyone in person in the near future. Steve, do you want to make any other concluding comments? Or
No, just what you said. I mean, really, just stay safe out there and continue to look for upcoming events and work with your AWS solutions architect. Reach out to us. We're here to help.
All right, thank you all very much.